Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10, and today I'm going to do a deep dive into the trinomial cube. Today I am going to give you a lot of information about the trinomial cube, what comes before it, what materials are related to it, what comes after it, and I'm also going to show you a video of how to actually do the trinomial cube. But first of all, let's discuss what specifically is the trinomial cube. As you can see from the picture on the screen, I've included a picture of the trinomial cube. You can probably see that there's red, blue, yellow, and black, and they're in this pattern. And I'm going to show you the logic behind this pattern if you don't know it already, as well as the algebraic equation for what's going on inside and around the trinomial cube. First of all, this Montessori material is found in the sensorial area of the primary classroom. This material is used in the primary 3 to 6 age group, but it is a very important work as the child gets older in the elementary and upper elementary and even into the middle school ages. You can use this work in a lot of different ways to solve mathematical equations. But in the primary classroom, we use it more like a puzzle, and so that's why we call it a sensorial material. So the trinomial cube is a box with 27 wooden cubes and rectangular prisms painted in various colors. As you can see, the yellow, black, blue, red are the colors that we're going to use for the trinomial cube. The trinomial cube is a concrete representation of the algebraic formula a plus b plus c to the third power. The factors of the equation are represented by the cubes and the prisms. The lid shows the pattern in plane dimension. And the trinomial cube is similar to the binomial cube. So for those of you that are familiar with Montessori works, the binomial cube is a little smaller. It does not have the added layer of the third layer that is represented with the yellow cube. But it is the binomial cube would become before the trinomial cube and would be a little bit easier of a version. And usually we start the child with the binomial cube before we go to the trinomial cube. So let's talk about the sensorial area really quick. So the sensorial area is pretty much what it sounds like. The child, in the 3 to 6 age group, the child receives accurate impressions of the real world and refines them to their greatest potential. So that's what happens in the sensorial area of the classroom, is that the child is refining their senses at that point in time. And this is important because we want the child to have an accurate impression of the world. The more accurate the impression of the world the child receives, the more that they can apply that knowledge. They can build the neurological foundation and the neural pathways to understand the world around them. So the refinement of the senses is an important sensitive period during the first plane, which is the 0 to 6 years of life. And it's only after the child develops their sense, let's say their visual sense in isolation, do we introduce non-isolating qualities. So that means that we have an isolation of difficulty. For example, each visual quality is introduced separately before combining them, such as color, size, and shape. We want the child to refine the visual sense, but we want to do it very carefully in the Montessori classroom. So therefore, we have works that allow the child to develop their sense of understanding color and to discern shape, to discern size. So all of those qualities are worked on separately before we put them together to work on something as complicated as a trinomial cube. So this idea follows the Montessori's simple to complex philosophy. We want to start out very simple, have our isolation of difficulty, and then move from that simple to more complex works. The reason we do this is because, one, Maria Montessori observes that it's important for the child's development to start with isolation of difficulty. But another reason why we work this way in the sensorial area of the Montessori classroom is because it helps to develop imagination. And I'm not going to go too deep into this idea right now, simply because I have another video on my YouTube page that that goes into the development of imagination. And if you're curious about that, please look for that video, and I'll try, if I can remember, I'll try and link that at the end of this video. But to go into a little summary of what the development of imagination is in the Montessori environment, the Montessori believed that the development of imagination was built through sensorial impressions of the world. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is giving the child the chance to develop their senses so that they can have a more accurate impression of the world around them, which allows them to access their imagination as they get older. The more accurate the impression, the more the imagination can be developed, because the imagination needs to start in reality. And the reason why we develop the imagination in reality instead of fantasy is because it allows for purposeful work. Purposeful work brings the child from a state of fantasy to imagination. This means that the creativity of the child has a purpose and an active outlet, rather than an inward deterioration of wishful thinking or unempowered thought. So we want to empower children in the way that we give them opportunities to work out their imagination is through, especially in the 0 to 6 age group, is really through the concrete materials, giving them active things to do. A child doesn't want to pretend to wash dishes. They actually want to wash dishes. They don't want to pretend to bake. They do often do the pretend play, but that's only because they don't have access to actual materials for baking. But when we provide that, when we provide real experiences, the child gets more out of it. It's more purposeful and more fulfilling. And I would really encourage anybody who is curious about this idea to go into a child care facility if you have the opportunity and just observe the pretend play that happens in child care, and then compare that even in a toddler room. And then go and compare that to a Montessori classroom, toddler, primary, especially, and see the difference between when a child actually does the concrete physical work and when they are just pretending. I think you'll see that the concrete, real experiences are much more fulfilling and help the child build more skills and connect better to reality. And in return, that reality will serve their mind later on in life to be more creative, because they have these neural pathways built up through real experiences. Just to give you a little further example, think about how some of the greatest inventors, creators, and engineers, artists, all began their work with observations of reality. A lot of artists spend a lot of time observing the environment around them. And while some of the art that they go into becomes very fantastical, it has a realistic basis. This idea of creating based on concrete, realistic experiences that build the imagination, shows that this stimulated their minds and served as the foundation for new ideas and new mechanisms. So reality and concrete impressions really are the foundation for imagination. So where do we find the lesson for the trinomial cube in the AMI album? It's in the sensorial album, as I stated before. It's in the sensorial area. So in an AMI, in the AMI albums, you're going to find it in the sensorial album. And it's in a category called visual non-isolating qualities. So what does the child need to know before being introduced to this lesson? And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey through the different works that the child has experienced in regards to the visual sense that leads them to the trinomial cube. So first of all, the child needs to have lessons on visual isolating materials for size, shape, and color. And the child must be proficient in each of these qualities in isolation before exploring them together. So let's look at the first category. It's isolation of difficulty, which we're going to look at as size and dimension. On the left-hand side, you're going to see pictures of the cylinder blocks, and I've put some language to go with it. You're also going to see the brown stairs, the pink tower, and the red rods. These are all visual works. while the child is working with their hands, really the discernment that we're looking for in these materials has to do with understanding size and dimension. So the cylinder blocks can reflect the pink tower, brown stair, and red rods. So there's a cylinder block that gets associated with the brown stair, which is thick to thin. There's a cylinder block that's associated with the pink tower, which is large to small. And then there's a cylinder block which is associated with the red rods, which is long and short. And then there's a fourth cylinder block which changes in every dimension, so there is no language for it, and it's not represented by another material, at least not at this point in time. If you look at the knobless cylinders, there is a box that is the same as the knobbed cylinders though. So the pink tower changes in all dimensions. It goes large to small. This is after the cylinder blocks, you would introduce the pink tower, and it's easier to discern the changes in size in the pink tower because it does change in all the dimensions. So the brown stairs would come next, and those change in only 2 dimensions, and the language to that is thick to thin. So it gets a little bit harder when you only are discerning the difference in 2 dimensions. And then after that would come the red rods, and in the red rods it changes only in 1 dimension, and so the language for that is long to short. And that will be the hardest of the 3 between the pink tower, brown stairs, and red rods. The red rods would be the hardest to discern the difference in size because it only changes in that 1 dimension. So those are the materials that the child would experience relating to size and dimension before the trinomial cube. The next category would be isolation of difficulty for color. So there's a little bit of a journey for color that we go on before we would introduce the trinomial cube. The first color work that we would introduce in the sensorial area would be color box 1. And on the picture on the right, you can see that there are some different boxes there. The first one is a very small box with just red, yellow, and blue. We call this color box 1, and it has 2 sets of tiles for each color, and you do a matching game with this. We do not introduce language with this first color box. It's simply getting to explore those 3 primary colors, and also getting to see if the child has the ability to visually match those colors together. And you think, well, that's pretty easy. Of course they would, but you know, we're really looking for even sometimes we have children as young as 2.5 in the primary classroom. We really are interested in seeing whether or not the child can discern the difference between the red, the yellow, and the blue. And we know that if they have difficulty doing that, we want to keep an eye on that and see if they progress or not. And we know if they don't progress, maybe that means at some point we'll need to send them for a referral of some sort. So that is, while it seems very simple, it is a very important first step to understanding how the child is visually discerning color. The next box is color box 2. This includes primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, and they are also introduced with matching tiles together in a box, so you're going to have 2 of each color again. And after the child is introduced to the work, then we would introduce the language for all the different colors in color box 2. We'd also have the matching games available. You could do matching at a distance, and matching to the environment is also possible with color box 2. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but I do want to take a moment to say it is very important in Montessori that we give a sensorial impression of the work before we do any language, which basically means that the child is working with the material and comfortable with the material and understands the material before we give them any language. So I would not introduce the language for red and yellow and blue if the child is not matching them correctly, if the child's not working with them to the point where they're being proficient with the work. I would not introduce the language yet. And that would be true of the visual, any of the senses. But if you go back to the last slide where we were talking about the pink tower and the brown stair, if the child can't build the pink tower correctly, I would not be giving language until I saw that the child had been able to build it correctly in order and sees the gradation of large to small before I introduce the concept of large to small with language. So then there's color box 3. Going back to our isolation of difficulty for color, we have color box 3. And this is a gradation of colors. And we have the same colors as color box 2, but instead of the matching tiles, we have a gradation. And this really gets to, I find this work particularly difficult. I'm not great at identifying all the gradation, but it's not about being perfect. It's about just exploring those colors and trying your best. We don't correct the child if they don't put them in order. So if a child has all the blue tiles out, and you can obviously see that it's not even close to being from dark to light or light to dark, I wouldn't correct them. I would just watch, I would observe, and I would see if over the weeks or maybe even months, if the child gets to a point where they are progressing through the colors, I would definitely keep an eye on that. And then there is also language that goes with this, because you can have comparatives and superlatives with this lesson, because you have lightest to darkest, lighter, darker. So anytime you have comparatives and superlatives with gradation, you can introduce that language as well after you introduce the original language for the work. So with the color box 3, the different things you can do with it is that not only just put them in order of darkest to lightest or lightest to darkest, you can also explore the color through matching it to the environment. And I know that there are a lot of different places that do a lot of design work and show different cards and patterns for the children to use with color box 3, but in an AMI album, we don't get into a lot of those types of extensions. We have extensions, but not necessarily those type of extensions, because we really want the child to not follow a pattern that we set out for them. So while they can do different designs with color box 3, we don't set out a specific visual aid for them to do a pattern. We really want them to explore it. And that's really true of any of the sensorial materials. We're very careful about the extensions we put out in AMI, because we really want to see if the child can figure out, well, how does the pink tower and the brown stair fit together? You know, what are their similarities? What are the differences? And we don't want to tell the child that. We want them to explore the material to the extent where they're curious enough to see how different things in the environment are related. And that is really an important step for the child, that we have to be careful as guides not to take that opportunity away from them by instructing them too much or giving them too many lessons, that they lose the ability to explore the material further in the classroom and see how materials relate to one another. So this next slide is about the isolation of difficulty for shapes, and you're going to find this particularly with the geometry cabinet is a big work for the identification of shapes. So the geometry cabinet is how we introduce a lot of different shapes. We have triangles, we have polygons, we have quadrilaterals, and when we introduce, we have circles and squares as well, rectangles. And just like before, everything we do with the geometry cabinet, we give a sensorial impression of the shapes through tracing the shapes and the insets with our fingers. Some people use a stylus. I do not use a stylus with the geometry cabinet. That comes with the leaf cabinet. So with the geometry cabinet, I do have the child trace the shape visually with they have to track it with their eyes while they trace it with their hands. So you're giving a sensorial impression of the shapes, and then language is introduced. And when it comes to language, yes, we are going to introduce, like, if we're doing the triangles, I would introduce like an acute isosceles triangle. This becomes very important to understand this language and be able to identify like an equilateral triangle. We want to understand what the scaling, acute, obtuse, isosceles, equilateral, all of those are important terms that the child needs to be introduced to in the geometry cabinet, and that'll become even more important when we go into more advanced language lessons, such as the detective adjective, which goes more into the grammar concepts as the child gets into kindergarten. So we do introduce all the language, we introduce the polygons, we give the quadrilaterals, and my favorite of all the geometry cabinets and metal insets is always the quatrefoil, because it's the most fun to say. So anyways, there are a lot of extensions you can do with the geometry cabinet. There is the matching at a distance, just regular matching as well, matching to cards, and then you can play a game called What's Missing, and that can go from very small amount of shapes to the entire cabinet if needed. And I played that with some of my older children, and it gets a little messy. It's a big work, but it's a lot of fun too, and it will keep them busy as they get older, and sometimes they need that extra challenge of getting out all the shapes and then taking one away and playing the game What's Missing. So that's a pretty fun game too, and that really will solidify understanding the different shapes. We also have a botany cabinet in the sensorial area. It's going to be the same as the geometry cabinet. We do use the stylus though instead of the fingers for this, and the language for leaves is introduced in the botany cabinet, which some of those names are really quite technical. So for those of you going through AMI training, it's a lot of fun to memorize orbiculate and reniform and sagittate and all the different leaf names. So that's one thing you will get to look forward to learning as you get into your AMI training. So let's get into the trinomial cube. The first thing I want to talk about is control of error. In the Montessori environment, everything needs to be considered in terms of what is the control of error. And by the control of error, we mean, how does the child know that they accomplished this work correctly? How do they know that they did this work right without, and we never want the guide to be the person that tells the child whether or not they're doing the materials right. You know, the control of error either needs to be within the child, within the work itself, such as like the cylinder blocks, you'll know if you did it right if the cylinder fits correctly. So that would be the control of error. So for the trinomial cube, the control of error is within the child, his ability to discriminate color and size. Can he match the shapes together? Can he match the sizes together? Can he make sure that red only touches red or black only touches black? Another control of error, though, for the environment can also be another child. While as a guide, I don't want to be the one correcting the child. It is fine if another child comes along and corrects the child, as long as they are respectful, as long as they are kind, and as long as the child is willing to receive that criticism. And that in itself is a grace and courtesy lesson that we often have to teach, and it may be something that we have to work through with a particular child a lot. But sometimes some children are just really good at coming over there and helping out and giving some feedback in a way that doesn't offend another child. So it really just depends on the child whether or not the control of error being another child is working well. So the other control of error for the trinomial cube is within the material itself. One way to know if you did it right, and this is not always a guarantee, but one way to tell if you did it right is if the lid does not close, or if the lid closes, if you can put the sides up on the trinomial cube and the lid fits, then that's a pretty good indication that the child has done at least a lot of correct things with the material. If the lid does not close, if the sides do not close, then the child knows, there's something in here I need to fix. So the child automatically goes back to take a look at their work. Sometimes they need help, sometimes they figure it out, but we really want to make sure that the child is getting that feedback mostly from the material, because, and I think as adults we need to come to the understanding that we really enjoy it when we find the solution to a problem too. We don't necessarily want somebody hanging out just waiting for us to make a mistake, looking over our shoulder to see if we're doing it right. As an adult, I don't enjoy that. I would rather figure out how to solve a problem on my own, maybe occasionally get a little bit of help, but not too much. And I think it's when you think about it in those terms, I think it's pretty reasonable to understand that a child really has those same feelings too. And so every time we think about how to correct a child, we also need to think about how we enjoy being corrected. And once we reflect on that, we see, yeah, it's really important for the child to have materials that can give him feedback instead of the adult giving him feedback. So let's talk a little bit about the direct purpose of the trinomial cube. Well, it's to build a trinomial cube. So that's pretty easy. But in an AMI album, we are always looking at control of error and direct purpose. One of the reasons why we want to think in terms of direct purpose for all of our works is if a work is not purposeful, then we don't put it in the classroom. And that's one thing if you're trying to do a homeschool environment or start a classroom or use some Montessori ideas in your environment, always think about what is the purpose of this work. And if you can't think of a purpose for the work, if you can't think of direct purpose and control of error, you may need to rethink whether or not you want to have that material out on the shelf. Chances are if they don't have a direct purpose, they don't have a control of error, there's a good chance that the work and the material might get abused or out of control. So I find that being able to think through the direct purpose and the control of error for everything I put on the shelf, whether it's just something I'm thinking of for, let's say, summer camp, or even something I'm thinking of putting out for practical life, I still think through these steps because I know that this will help me understand what a child is getting out of this experience. There's also indirect purpose. Not every work in the Montessori classroom has an indirect purpose, but this one does. The trinomial cube's indirect purpose is preparation for algebra to prove the formula a plus b plus c to the third power. So there is an indirect purpose, and you're going to see that a lot more as the child gets older. It's also a preparation for cube roots, and this will also relate really well to the bead cabinet. And if you've never seen a bead cabinet, feel free to Google it. And the bead chains get into squares and cubes as you count them out. In the age of the trinomial cube, we introduced this work around 3.5 to 4.5 years old. So when the child comes in at 2.5 to 3 years old into the primary classroom, they're going to have that sensorial journey of exploring his senses in all the isolation of difficulties that we covered. And then when he gets the trinomial cube, he'll have the binomial cube before that, and then the trinomial cube. And what that's going to do is it's going to put together color, size, shape, and the child is going to have to discern all three of those qualities in order to finish this work. And I just wanted to go over the equations real quick for you. So we have one yellow cube in the trinomial cube that's represented by c to the third power. And then we have three smaller prisms, which is b, c squared, and then the larger prisms are a times c to the second power. So those are the equations for the yellow cubes. These are the equations for the blue cubes. I'll let you look over that. These are the equations for the black prisms. These are the equations for the red. And now it's time for the trinomial cube presentation, which before I show it to you, I just want you to, if you're interested in AMI training, I want you to think about this in terms of what would it feel like to go through training. So when the trainer presents a work for the first time, you're supposed to watch. That's the goal anyways. Training gets crazy and busy, and some training centers might do things a little differently, but for the most part, the trainer will present the lesson. You're going to watch it in its entirety, and then the trainer will usually present it a second time. This is when you write down every single itty bitty little step, and it reads kind of more like a recipe. So when you're writing down your notes, it's not necessarily full sentences. But for instance, the first step in all AMI lessons will be invite the child for a lesson. So step one right there. And then the second step might be show the child how to take the work off the shelf, and then you would describe in detail how you would hold the material, and then you put it back on the shelf, invite the child to pick it up, take it to a table, and then sit down. And then the first step is basically from that point on, is describing the movement, such as what am I doing with my hands? I'm lifting the lid off and I'm putting it diagonal to the box. And so you're going to write down in very specific details what is actually happening. And the reason why you do this is because you want to have excellent notes about the orientation of the work, how to pick up the work, and every step of the way you want to have detailed notes, because these are your lessons for when you are on your own. And you want to make sure that if you're about to present this lesson to a child, that if you have to go back and read through your lesson plans, you're going to have it. Your notes are going to be so well defined, so detailed, that you can see it happening in your head as you're writing it, as you're reading it, so that when you go to give that lesson, you feel confident about what it is you need to do. So the better notes you take, the better lessons you'll be able to present later on. And there are some lessons in an AMI album you don't get to present very often, such as some of the more advanced math and language lessons you don't usually get to do, like maybe racks and tubes. You don't get to do that very often in a Montessori primary environment. So taking good notes of especially the more complicated materials for the older children are really going to serve you well. The last step for a lesson is always to remind the child where the material goes on the shelf after the child has finished working with it. That's always the last step, because it is very important in the Montessori environment that everything goes back to where it belongs. Unlike childcare, we don't leave our work laying on the floor. Well, we're not supposed to leave our work laying on the floor. Reality does happen though, but the goal is the child takes out the work, the child works with it, the child puts it back on the shelf. Everything looks beautiful for the next child. This is part of our grace and courtesy. This is a part of building character and discipline, and not just understanding how to do a work cognitively, but how to care for the environment, how to care for others, how to make the room beautiful, and also how to teach children to wait patiently for a work. So if a child walks away in the middle of the work and another child just comes along and works with it whenever they want, then they don't learn to wait patiently for the work that they want to do. And then that is a really important concept in the 3 to 6 environment. I am now going to stop the slideshow for a moment so that you can watch the video of the presentation. I just wanted to let you know that the video will not have any sound, and this is so that you can focus on the lesson and the movement of the hands and focus specifically on the materials without being distracted by other noise or by my words. Montessori lessons for primary age children, especially the younger children, often have very limited or no language during the first presentation. This allows the child to focus on the material instead of the guide or the teacher. Whenever we use words, whenever we talk, that brings the child's focus away from the material and back onto the guide and what the guide is saying. And the words should only be in the lesson if they are very purposeful and if they have if they are absolutely necessary. We don't want to use extra words during those moments, because really we want the child to be focusing on that sensorial impression, particularly with sensorial materials. So without further ado, now comes the sensorial video of the trinomial cube. So now that you have seen the lesson for the trinomial cube, I thought I'd just go over some of the extensions and related lessons after the child is proficient in building the trinomial cube inside the box. So one extension is to build outside the box. Building by layer, and on the right hand side of the slide you're going to see that I've put the cube in order by layers from the largest, medium, small layers. And then there's also building by color, which is represented by the lower left picture that has only the red cube and prisms. And then splitting the cube, which is kind of fun. Children really like the lesson on splitting the cube, and that is represented by the top left picture. And you can split the cube sideways, you can split them front and back, and all of these lessons can also be done with the binomial cube as well. So those are the same extensions for binomial cube. And then if you really need an extra challenge, and this is really good for adults too, is the stereognostic sense. And what do I mean by stereognostic sense? Basically, the stereognostic sense, there is an entire area in the AMI album for this, is to take away the visual sense. So now we've built up all these visual senses, right? And the extension for this one, and the cylinder blocks are the same way. There's a lot of things that you can do in the sensorial area where we take vision away through a blindfold and have the child explore it with their hands. And so this sense that Maria Montessori talked about, the stereognostic sense, she observed that children were really interested in understanding objects as a whole. It's not really about being in isolation. It's about understanding what an object is through feeling it as a whole, such as closing your eyes and understanding by the size and the shape that I'm holding the red cube. I know that would be the red cube. It's the largest, and I understand the way it feels in my hand that is the red cube. And so putting this together with a blindfold, either inside or outside of the box, is another step that you can take to extend this lesson out further. So besides the trinomial cube, what else is the child learning at this age? So at the 3.5 to 4.5 age group, the child is doing constructive triangles, graded geometric figures. And with the graded geometric figures, if anybody has seen them, we don't just let the child dig through them as they want. We start out with one box and one shape with one color. It's very limited, and as soon as we see a child can work with one shape and one color from one box, we allow them to through to 2. And so we always start small, and this is the same thing going back to color box 3. We don't let the child just get out all the tiles at once. We want to see that they can work with one color first, and then maybe 2. So whenever there's a big work that just seems like you're thinking, that would get really messy real quick, we don't start out with all of them at once. We start out with maybe one group, or if it's the geometry cabinet, we introduce 3 shapes at a time. We don't try to do all of the materials at the same time. Another work that a child is experiencing during the 3.5 to 4.5 age, when they would be introduced to the trinomial cube, is sandpaper letters, maybe the movable alphabet, and the phonetic object box. So depending on where they are with their reading, they may still be working on that sound to symbol relationship. They might be building simple words with the movable alphabet, or some of them might be ready to read. They might be ready for those very simple phonetic words, which we introduce with an object box. Another thing that they'd be working on at this point in time is the development of the hand through metal insets and through the chalkboard. And they also are probably working on group 1 math, which is numbers 0 to 10. They could also be preparing for an introduction to group 2 math, which is the decimal system or the golden beads. They also can be working on group 6 in math, which is fractions. And before you think that is a really crazy idea, if you're not familiar with Montessori, fraction insets are really more of a sensorial work up until the child is closer to 5 years old. It's really the sensorial impression of how the fractions are perceived. They're really just exploring through designs, and then they can have sensorial impression of doing different simple math ideas with the fractions. I won't get too far into that right now, but the fractions are extremely interesting and I do like them. So maybe I'll make another video on that. But you'll have to comment below and tell me if you're interested in the fractions, and then if that's something you're excited about, I can give a in-depth lesson about that. And then of course, practical life. The work that they'd be doing at Practical Life during the time that they are practicing the trinomial cube really could be any number of things, because Practical Life at the point where they're 3.5 to 4.5, you really want to have a series of logical and orderly steps that expand concentration and develop the hand. And they're combining skills at this point in time. When they first move into the primary environment, a 2.5-year-old to 3-year-old are really just focusing isolated skills such as simple pouring with dry objects, and then moving on to pouring with maybe a small glass of water. And then from there, we start combining different things, such as scrubbing a table combines pouring water, sponging up water, drying a table, and a lot of different combinations of skills. So depending on where the child is at in terms of how many skills they can combine at one time and how much concentration they have, there could be any number of practical life skills that they'll be practicing at this point in time. They'll also be practicing the dressing frames. Usually they practice something as simple as the button frame when they come in. So by the time they get to 4.5, you really want them to be starting to work on that bow tying frame, the lacing frame, maybe the safety pins. They'll also be working on sewing a button. So those are a few ideas for where the child is working in other areas while they are also being introduced to the trinomial cube. So how does the trinomial cube prepare the child for later on in life? Well, first of all, it gives them the understanding of volume. As I stated before, the indirect purpose is for cubing and cube roots. So that's part of the indirect purpose of the trinomial cube. And it's introduced concretely with the bead chains in the primary environment as well. So these ideas are working in tandem with other materials in the classroom as well. It's also a preparation for algebra. And you also can, since the binomial and trinomial cubes come before the decanomial square, by the time you introduce the decanomial square, sometimes also known as the square of Pythagoras, the binomial and trinomial squares that you can make out of the decanomial square is going to be very familiar to the child after working with the binomial and trinomial cubes. So that's another lesson that the child will have some visual familiarity with when they get to that. So anyways, that's all I have for you today. I hope you like this lesson. I hope you find it fun. I hope that it's something that you can use either in your classroom or your homeschool environment. And as always, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.